The nurse said it quietly. "Sir, your wife is in active labor." In the hallway of St. Matthew Medical Center, Elena Fairchild was being wheeled toward the delivery room, one hand gripping the rail, her breathing uneven with pain. Her husband, Albert Whitmore, stood a few steps away with a small leather suitcase. He glanced once at the closed doors, then at the message lighting up his phone. "Sabrina. Are you on your way to the airport?" Albert's side turned and walked toward the elevator. Hours later, Elena would give birth to their son alone. And by morning, she would become the sole heir to a $500 million inheritance Albert had never even heard of. The elevator doors closed before he ever looked back. Before this story unfolds, take a second and tell me where you're watching from, your city and your local time. Stories like this remind us that dignity and truth have a way of surfacing even when people think no one is watching. And if you believe that quiet strength deserves to be heard, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The story of Elena Fairchild is only beginning. Long before anyone in that hospital hallway understood what was unfolding, Elena Fairchild had already spent years learning how to live quietly inside disappointment. From the outside, the marriage between Elena Fairchild and Albert Whitmore looked almost effortless. They lived in a restored brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, the kind of home with tall windows, polished wooden stairs, and a narrow garden that caught the afternoon sun. Friends who visited would notice the framed photographs along the hallway dinner parties, charity galas, vacations in Napa Valley, Albert in tailored suits, Elena beside him in soft-colored dresses. It was the kind of life people described with a single word: stable. Albert liked that word. He liked the way it sounded when colleagues at his consulting firm spoke about him. "Whitmore's got it figured out," they would say. Career, house, wife, baby on the way. But stability, Elena had learned, was sometimes just another name for silence. Elena Fairchild had never been a loud person. Even as a child, she was the one who listened more than she spoke. Her grandmother, Margaret Fairchild, used to say that Elena had inherited the Fairchild habit of observation. "Some people react," Margaret once told her. "Fairchild women record." Elena never forgot that. Before her pregnancy, she had worked for a nonprofit legal research foundation in Boston. The job required patience, reviewing case files, verifying timelines, organizing documents for attorneys, preparing civil litigation. It was meticulous work, often invisible to the public eye, but Elena had always found comfort in the logic of records. Facts rarely raised their voices. They simply waited. Albert, on the other hand, lived in a world built on presentation. He was a senior corporate consultant for a strategy firm whose clients ranged from tech startups to financial institutions. Albert understood rooms quickly. He knew how to charm investors, how to guide conversations, how to leave meetings with people believing he was both indispensable and agreeable. When Elena first met him, that confidence had seemed reassuring. Albert was decisive. Albert made plans. Albert believed in forward motion. For a while, Elena mistook that certainty for reliability. The early years of their marriage passed easily enough. They attended work functions together, traveled occasionally, and spent holidays rotating between Albert's parents in Connecticut and quiet visits with Elena's grandmother in Maine. But over time, small changes began appearing so gradually they almost blended into daily routine. Albert began coming home later. First it was client dinners, then strategy meetings that stretched well past midnight. Eventually it became travel short consulting trips that Elena rarely asked about. When she did ask, Albert usually laughed it off. "You worry too much," he would say. Sometimes he added a softer phrase afterward. "You're too sensitive, Elena." He never shouted it. Albert rarely shouted. Instead, he spoke with the gentle impatience of someone correcting an overreaction. It took Elena a long time to understand that dismissal could be quieter than anger. During her pregnancy, the distance between them became more visible. By the time she reached her third trimester, Elena had already stopped expecting Albert to attend most appointments. Rachel Monroe did instead. Rachel had been Elena's closest friend since college, a journalist who had an instinct for reading people long before they finished speaking. Rachel never pretended to like Albert much, but she respected Elena enough not to interfere unless asked. One afternoon, after driving Elena home from a prenatal checkup, Rachel lingered in the kitchen while Elena poured tea. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked. The question sounded casual, but Elena knew Rachel too well. "Yes," Elena said quietly. Rachel leaned against the counter. "Elena." Elena placed the kettle down carefully before answering. "He's busy." Rachel didn't reply immediately. Instead, she studied the kitchen table. It was covered with Elena's usual quiet order: a notebook, a laptop, several envelopes of household bills, and a small folder. Rachel tapped the folder lightly. "You're still keeping records?" Elena nodded. Inside that folder were copies of things most people ignored: credit card statements, airline confirmations, calendar entries. Albert never noticed Elena reviewing them. When she sat with her laptop at night, he assumed she was browsing parenting forums or reading about newborn care. But Elena had always trusted patterns more than explanations. And patterns had begun to appear. Charges from restaurants Albert claimed were business dinners. Flights, he said, were client travel. Hotel reservations that didn't align with his meeting schedules. None of it was explosive. Individually, every line item looked ordinary. Together they formed something quieter, something incomplete, something Elena couldn't yet name. At 36 weeks pregnant, her doctor had advised her to rest more frequently. But Elena's mind rarely rested. At night, when the house was quiet and Albert was still away on another late meeting, she sometimes opened her laptop and read through the records again. Not searching for confrontation, searching for clarity. There was a difference. Albert never noticed the way Elena observed him when he returned home. How she registered the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume once. How she saw the way he checked his phone before greeting her. Or how his tone shifted when certain names appeared on the screen. One of those names had begun appearing often: Sabrina. The first time Elena saw it, Albert had been standing near the window in their living room typing quickly. The name flashed across the screen for only a second before he tilted the phone away. Elena didn't ask about it. Albert assumed she hadn't noticed. But later that evening, while Albert showered upstairs, Elena opened the shared laptop account Albert sometimes used for work. It took less than 10 minutes. Sabrina Cole, marketing consultant, New York. The details were thin, but the name stayed with her. Elena did not confront Albert. Confrontation required certainty, and Elena preferred evidence. Weeks passed. The house grew quieter. Albert traveled more frequently, and Elena's due date approached. One evening in early spring, Elena sat alone in the living room, her hands resting on the curve of her stomach while soft rain tapped against the windows. She could feel the baby shifting, a slow, steady movement, life preparing to arrive. Albert was supposed to return by 8. He arrived at 10:30. He looked tired but composed the way he always did after work trips. "Elena," he said casually, setting his keys on the table, "you're still awake?" She nodded. "How was your trip?" Albert loosened his tie. Long meetings, nothing interesting. He walked into the kitchen to pour himself a drink. Behind him, Elena watched silently. She didn't ask more questions. She didn't need to. Because earlier that afternoon, another email confirmation had appeared in their shared inbox. A flight reservation. Boston to Miami. Departure Friday morning. 2 days before her due date. Passenger name Albert Whitmore. And the second ticket, Sabrina Cole. Elena closed her laptop slowly. Outside, the rain continued falling in soft, patient rhythm. Inside the quiet house, Elena Fairchild began writing down another date, another time, another line in a record that one day soon would no longer remain silent. The morning Elena Fairchild went into labor began quietly. It was just past 6 when she woke to a slow tightening across her abdomen. At first, she thought it was the familiar discomfort she had been feeling during the last week of pregnancy. Dr. Daniel Harper had warned her the body often practiced before the real moment arrived. But this was different. The pain came again 10 minutes later, then 8, then 6. Elena lay still for a moment in the dim bedroom, breathing carefully, while pale winter light slipped through the tall windows of the Back Bay brownstone. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of traffic beginning to wake outside. Albert had already left, or rather, he had never come home. He had texted shortly after midnight. Working late. Don't wait up. Elena did not reply. Instead, she reached for the notebook on the nightstand and wrote the time of the first contraction. 6:07 a.m. Another wave tightened across her stomach. 6:15. She wrote that down too. By 7 o'clock, Elena knew. This was not practice. She called Rachel Monroe. Rachel answered on the second ring. "Elena, I think it's time." Rachel was silent for only a second. "I'm coming." 40 minutes later, Rachel's car pulled up outside the brownstone. The sky had turned the color of thin steel, and a light wind pushed dry leaves along the sidewalk. Rachel rushed through the front door without knocking. "Elena, in here?" Elena was standing in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, breathing slowly through another contraction. Rachel walked over immediately, steady and calm. "Okay," Rachel said gently. "Hospital bag, by the door." Rachel grabbed it. "Have you called, Albert?" Elena shook her head. "Not yet." Rachel studied her face for a moment. "I'll drive." The ride to St. Matthew Medical Center took 20 minutes. Rachel drove faster than usual, but carefully glancing at Elena every few minutes. "How far apart?" Rachel asked. 5 minutes. Rachel exhaled. Good timing, then. They arrived just after 8. Inside the maternity wing, the air carried the sterile scent of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Nurses moved quickly but calmly, guiding Elena through the admissions process before wheeling her into a labor room. Rachel stayed beside her while a nurse attached monitors. "First baby?" the nurse asked. Elena nodded. "You're doing great," the nurse said reassuringly. Rachel squeezed Elena's hand. "Albert on his way." Elena hesitated. "I'll call him now." Rachel stepped into the hallway with Elena's phone. The first call went to voicemail. The second rang longer. Finally, Albert answered. His voice sounded distracted. "Hey." Rachel didn't bother with pleasantries. "It's Rachel. Elena's in labor. We're at St. Matthew." A pause. Already, Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "Yes, already." Albert exhaled. "Okay, I'm on my way." Rachel returned to the room. "He's coming." Elena nodded once. Another contraction came stronger this time. She gripped the bed rail, breathing slowly while the nurse adjusted the monitor. Hours passed in a blur of rising intensity. By late morning, Elena's contractions had become sharp and regular. Rachel stayed beside her through each wave, speaking softly, reminding her to breathe. Around noon, the door opened. Albert Whitmore walked in. He looked polished as always, dark coat pressed shirt phone in hand, but there was a faint impatience in his expression, as though the timing of the day had inconvenienced him. "Elena," he said. She looked at him, breathing through another contraction. Rachel noticed the first thing Albert did. He checked his watch. "How long?" he asked the nurse. The nurse glanced at the monitor. "She's progressing. Could still be several hours." Albert nodded absently. His phone vibrated. He glanced down. The name on the screen was one Elena had already memorized. Sabrina. Albert turned the phone face down quickly. Rachel saw it. So did Elena. But Elena said nothing. The nurse finished adjusting the monitor and stepped out of the room. Rachel followed, leaving Elena and Albert alone for a moment. Albert sat in the chair beside the bed. "You okay?" he asked. Elena nodded. Another contraction tightened across her stomach. Albert shifted uncomfortably. His phone buzzed again. This time he stood. "I need to take this." Elena watched as he stepped into the hallway. The door didn't close fully. Rachel, standing near the nurse's station, heard the first part of the conversation. "Sabrina, I told you I'd call." Pause. "No, I'm still coming." Rachel's jaw tightened. Albert lowered his voice, but the hallway carried sound in strange ways. I can't miss the flight, he continued. A nurse passed Rachel, unaware of the tension thickening the air. Rachel leaned slightly closer to the wall. Inside the labor room, Elena could hear only fragments. Hospital. Couple hours. I said I'd be there. Another contraction forced her to close her eyes. Outside, Rachel stepped into the hallway fully. Albert. He turned surprised. Rachel didn't raise her voice. Elena is in active labor. Albert rubbed his forehead. I know. Then why are you talking about flights? Albert's expression hardened slightly. Rachel, this is complicated. No, Rachel said quietly. It isn't. Albert glanced toward the labor room door. She's still early. The doctor said it could take hours. Rachel stared at him. You're leaving? Albert sighed, lowering his voice further. I have a client trip. Rachel laughed, once a sharp, disbelieving sound. A client trip. Albert didn't answer. From inside the room, Elena called weakly. Rachel stepped back inside immediately. Another contraction had started. Elena gripped the rail, her breathing uneven now. Rachel held her hand. You're okay. Albert remained in the doorway. The nurse returned moments later and checked the monitor again. Contractions are getting stronger, she said. We'll keep progressing. Albert glanced down at his phone again. Another message from Sabrina. Did you get the Uber yet? Albert typed quickly. Then he looked toward Elena. I'll be right back, he said. He stepped into the hallway again. Rachel followed. Albert, she said quietly, don't do this. Albert picked up his suitcase from the floor. I'll come back tonight. Rachel stared at him. You're leaving while your wife is in labor. Albert adjusted his coat. She'll be fine. Inside the room, Elena heard the distant sound of the elevator bell at the end of the hallway. Another contraction surged through her body, stronger than the last. She gripped Rachel's hand. Rachel looked toward the hallway. Albert Whitmore was already walking away. Neither of them spoke his name again. And somewhere across the city, a flight to Miami was preparing for departure. By the time Albert Whitmore's plane lifted into the pale afternoon sky above Boston, Elena Fairchild was already deep in the kind of pain that reduces the world to breath and endurance. The labor room at St. Matthew Medical Center had grown quieter as the hours passed. Outside the tall windows, the gray winter light slowly faded toward evening, but inside the room, time seemed to move in uneven fragments. Minutes stretched, then vanished. Dr. Daniel Harper arrived shortly after 2 in the afternoon. He had the calm, practiced demeanor of someone who had delivered thousands of babies and understood that every birth carried its own unpredictable rhythm. He reviewed Elena's chart and glanced at the monitor tracking her contractions. You're progressing well, he said gently. This may still take a few hours. Rachel Monroe stood beside the bed, one hand resting lightly on Elena's shoulder. Elena nodded, though another contraction was already beginning to build. Pain arrived like a wave she could not outrun. She gripped the bed rail and breathed through it, eyes closed, concentrating on the steady voice of the nurse guiding her through the rhythm. Slow breath in and out. Rachel wiped a strand of damp hair from Elena's forehead. You're doing great, she whispered. Elena said nothing. Talking required energy she no longer had. Instead, she focused on breathing. The hours passed in cycles of rising pain and brief recovery. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped softly. Somewhere down the hallway, a newborn cried the sound sharp and bright in the otherwise controlled quiet of the maternity ward. Rachel checked Elena's phone once. Still no message from Albert. At 5:30 in the evening, Dr. Harper returned to the room. He studied the monitor again and nodded slightly. It's time, he said. The delivery team moved quickly but calmly, preparing the room. Lights were adjusted. Equipment was brought closer. The nurse positioned Elena carefully while explaining each step. Rachel remained beside her. You're almost there, she said softly. Elena opened her eyes briefly. For a moment, she seemed to be looking beyond the room itself, past the ceiling lights and quiet machinery toward something only she could see. Then another contraction arrived. Stronger than all the others, the effort demanded everything she had. Minutes blurred into a narrow, focused struggle between exhaustion and determination. Then suddenly the tension in the room shifted. A cry filled the air. Sharp, alive. Dr. Harper smiled. "You have a son." The nurse lifted the newborn, gently wrapping him in a warm blanket before placing him in Elena's arms. For the first time in hours, Elena's breathing slowed. She looked down at the small face pressed against the soft fabric. Lucas. The name had come to her weeks earlier, one quiet evening, while sitting alone in the living room. Lucas Fairchild Whitmore. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around the edge of the blanket. Rachel wiped her eyes quickly and laughed softly. "He's perfect." Elena said nothing at first. She simply watched the slow rise and fall of the baby's breathing. Outside the hospital, the city continued its normal evening rhythm. Cars moving through traffic restaurant lights, turning on commuters returning home. But inside the room, the world had shifted into a smaller, quieter space, defined by a single, fragile life. Dr. Harper finished his final checks and nodded with satisfaction. "Both of you are doing well," he said. "You should get some rest." The nurses gradually cleared the room, leaving Rachel seated beside the bed, while Elena held Lucas close. For a long time, neither woman spoke. The silence felt peaceful after the intensity of the past hours. Finally, Rachel glanced at Elena's phone again. Still nothing. Rachel placed the phone face down on the table. Elena had already noticed. But she did not ask. She no longer needed confirmation of something she had already understood. Later that evening, a nurse helped Elena move into the recovery room. The lights were dimmer there, the atmosphere softer. Lucas slept quietly in the bassinet beside the bed. Rachel sat in a chair near the window, scrolling absently through the news on her phone. "Try to sleep," Rachel said gently. Elena closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Instead, her mind moved slowly through the events of the day. The empty chair beside the bed, the quiet hallway after Albert left, the steady rhythm of the monitors, and now, the small, steady breathing of the newborn beside her. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Elena's phone rang. Rachel looked up. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Rachel answered. "Hello." A man's voice spoke calmly on the other end. "Good evening. May I speak with Elena Fairchild?" Rachel hesitated. "Who's calling?" "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I'm an attorney representing the Fairchild family estate." Rachel glanced at Elena. "She just gave birth a few hours ago," Rachel said cautiously. "Congratulations to her," the voice replied gently. "I apologize for the timing, but I've been attempting to reach Miss Fairchild since yesterday. The matter is time-sensitive." Rachel covered the phone with her hand. "Elena," she whispered. "It's a lawyer. Something about your family estate?" Elena opened her eyes slowly. She took the phone. "This is Elena. Miss Fairchild," Jonathan Pierce said, his voice measured and respectful. "I'm very sorry to inform you that your grandmother, Margaret Fairchild, passed away 3 days ago." For a moment, Elena said nothing. Margaret had been elderly, but the news still settled heavily in the quiet hospital room. "I see," Elena said softly. "My condolences," Rachel whispered beside her. Jonathan Pierce continued. "Your grandmother left specific instructions in her will regarding the Fairchild Investment Trust. You are listed as the primary heir. There are several legal matters that require your attention." Elena stared at the sleeping child beside her. "When would you like to meet?" she asked calmly. "Whenever you're able," Jonathan said. "But there is one detail I should mention immediately." Rachel watched Elena's expression carefully. "The trust you are inheriting," Jonathan continued, "currently holds assets valued at approximately $500 million. The room became very quiet. Rachel blinked slowly. "500?" she whispered. But Elena did not react outwardly. She simply listened. "We will discuss the details in person," Jonathan said. "For now, please focus on your recovery and your child. I will arrange a meeting later this week." The call ended. Rachel stared at Elena. Did he say 500 million? Elena looked down at Lucas sleeping peacefully beside her. Her voice was steady. Yes, Rachel leaned back in the chair, stunned. Across the country, in a luxury hotel overlooking the lights of Miami Beach, Albert Whitmore lifted a glass of champagne beside Sabrina Cole. He had no idea what had just changed. Not the birth of his son, and certainly not the fortune that now belonged to the woman he had left behind. By the time Elena Fairchild placed her phone back on the small hospital table, the room had fallen into a deeper silence than before. Lucas slept beside her, wrapped tightly in the white hospital blanket, unaware that his first day in the world had already rearranged the course of several lives. Rachel Monroe remained frozen in the chair near the window. For once, the journalist who always seemed to have the right words had none. "Did he really say 500 million?" Rachel asked quietly after a long moment. Elena did not answer immediately. She reached over and adjusted the blanket around Lucas's tiny shoulders. The newborn stirred slightly, but continued sleeping. "Yes," Elena said at last. Rachel leaned back slowly. Elena, that's not just money. That's an empire." Elena looked toward the dim window, where the lights of Boston shimmered faintly against the glass. "My grandmother built most of it," she said quietly. Rachel blinked. "You knew I knew she had investments." But 500 million, Elena shook her head once. "No." Rachel exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead. "So the man who left you in labor just walked away from $500 million. Elena's gaze returned to Lucas. "He didn't walk away from money," she said softly. "He walked away from us." Rachel didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. Across the country, nearly 1,500 miles away, Albert Whitmore was standing on the balcony of a luxury suite overlooking Miami Beach. Warm ocean air carried the distant pulse of music from the hotel's rooftop bar. Sabrina Cole leaned against the glass railing, holding a champagne flute and watching the neon lights ripple across the water. "You finally made it," she said with a playful smile. Albert adjusted the collar of his shirt. "It took longer than I expected." Sabrina tilted her head. "Hospital drama?" Albert shrugged. "Elena went into labor this morning." Sabrina raised an eyebrow. "And you still came?" Albert gave a short laugh. "The doctor said it would take hours." He took a sip of champagne. "She has Rachel there." Sabrina studied him for a moment. "And the baby?" Albert glanced at his phone briefly. "No update yet." Sabrina leaned closer. "You're surprisingly calm about this." Albert slipped his phone into his pocket. "Elena worries too much about everything. She'll be fine." The music from the rooftop bar grew louder as another group of guests arrived. Down by the pool, laughter and conversation blended with the sound of splashing water. Sabrina ran a finger slowly along the rim of her glass. "You're sure she won't make a scene when you get back?" Albert shook his head. "Elena doesn't make scenes." He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he understood another person completely. "She's predictable." Sabrina smiled faintly. "That must make life easier." "It does," Albert said. He leaned casually against the balcony rail. "Elena prefers stability. She hates conflict, so she'll just accept everything." Albert considered the question for a moment. "She always has." Sabrina nodded slowly, though something thoughtful flickered behind her expression. "And the baby?" Albert shrugged again. "I'll meet him when I get back." He checked his phone. Still nothing. The message from Rachel Monroe had arrived earlier that evening. "Your son was born at 5:42 p.m. Albert had glanced at the notification briefly while sitting beside Sabrina at the hotel bar. Then he had typed a short reply. "Good." Now the message sat buried beneath newer notifications. Sabrina leaned forward, looking out over the bright strip of hotels and clubs along the shoreline. "You ever think about just starting over?" she asked casually. Albert turned toward her. "What do you mean? Different city?" she said. "Different life." Albert studied her expression carefully. Sabrina was ambitious. That had been obvious from the beginning. It was one of the things he liked about her. "You're talking about New York again," he said. Sabrina smiled. "It's where the real opportunities are." Albert nodded thoughtfully. His consulting work already took him there several times a year. With the right connections, a move could be possible. "Elena wouldn't go," Sabrina added lightly. Albert chuckled. "Elena barely likes leaving Boston." "So what would you do?" Albert looked back toward the city lights. Eventually, he paused. "I suppose things would evolve." Sabrina watched him closely. "You mean divorce?" Albert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another slow sip of champagne. "I mean, change," he said at last. Downstairs, music drifted upward in rhythmic waves. Inside the hotel room, Albert's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. A photo message from Rachel. He opened it. The image showed Elena in the hospital bed, pale but calm, holding the newborn child wrapped in white blankets. Lucas. Albert stared at the photo for only a second. Then he locked the screen and set the phone down on the balcony table. Sabrina noticed. "That him," Albert nodded. "Cute kid," she said. Albert didn't respond. His attention had already drifted back to the skyline. Sabrina stepped closer beside him. "You look like someone who just escaped something," she said. Albert smiled slightly. "Maybe I did." Meanwhile, in a quiet hospital room in Boston, Elena Fairchild had not slept. Lucas had awakened twice during the night, his small cries filling the dim space, before the nurse helped Elena learn how to soothe him. Rachel dozed briefly in the chair beside the window, though. She woke every time the baby stirred. At some point near dawn, Elena reached for her notebook again. It lay beside the hospital bed, where Rachel had placed it earlier. The same notebook Elena had used for months. Inside were pages filled with dates, times, small observations. Nothing dramatic, just records. She opened to a fresh page. March 14th. Albert left hospital at approximately 12:18 p.m. Flight Boston, Miami. Passenger confirmation previously recorded. She paused briefly before continuing. Lucas born 5:42 p.m. Healthy. No message from Albert since departure. Elena closed the notebook slowly. Across the country, Albert Whitmore slept late in a quiet hotel suite while the Miami sun climbed over the ocean. He believed the most difficult part of his life had been temporarily avoided. He believed Elena would continue being who she had always been. Quiet, patient, predictable. What Albert did not yet understand was that silence was not the same thing as surrender. And Elena Fairchild had already begun documenting the moment his version of the future ended. 3 days after Lucas was born, Elena Fairchild left St. Matthew Medical Center under a pale Boston sky that still carried the chill of early spring. Rachel Monroe drove them home. Lucas slept in the rear seat, secured carefully in a new car seat Rachel had installed the night before. Elena sat beside him in the back, one hand resting gently against the small bundle, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The city outside the car moved with its usual rhythm. Commuters crossing intersections, cafes opening their doors, buses sighing to a stop along Boylston Street. Life continued. Rachel glanced at Elena in the rearview mirror. "Jonathan Pierce called again this morning," she said. Elena nodded slightly. "I know. You're really going to meet him today, eh?" Elena looked down at Lucas. "The trust documents won't wait." Rachel turned onto Commonwealth Avenue. "Neither will sleep," she muttered. Elena managed the faintest hint of a smile. "I'll sleep later." Rachel knew better than to argue. By late morning, Elena was seated in a quiet conference room inside the offices of Pierce and Aldridge, a law firm housed in one of Boston's older financial district buildings. Lucas slept beside her in a portable bassinet Rachel had insisted on bringing. Across the polished wooden table sat two people, Jonathan Pierce and Laura Bennett. Jonathan Pierce was in his early 60s, silver-haired, composed with the calm authority of someone accustomed to handling large estates and complicated inheritances. Laura Bennett, younger by nearly 20 years, served as the financial director of the Fairchild Investment Trust. Her posture was precise, her voice measured, and her laptop was already open with several documents prepared. Jonathan folded his hands. "Miss Fairchild," he said gently, "first allow me to repeat how sorry I am for your loss. Margaret Fairchild was a remarkable woman." Elena nodded quietly. "She was." Jonathan continued. "She also planned very carefully for the future of her estate." Laura Bennett turned the laptop toward Elena. The screen displayed a series of charts and documents bearing the name Fairchild Investment Trust. Elena Laura said respectfully, "Your grandmother began building this trust nearly 40 years ago. It includes diversified investments in private equity real estate holdings, energy funds, and several long-term technology portfolios." Elena listened without interruption. The narrator knew something Laura Bennett did not yet realize. Elena had spent years reviewing legal and financial documents in her nonprofit work. She understood how to read balance sheets, how to notice risk, and how to ask questions that mattered. Laura continued. "The total estimated value of the trust at the time of Margaret Fairchild's passing is approximately $512 million. Rachel, seated quietly near the window, inhaled sharply again, despite already hearing the number days earlier. Elena remained still. Jonathan slid a thick folder across the table. "Your grandmother named you the sole beneficiary." Elena looked down at the documents. "And the trust structure?" she asked. Jonathan nodded, approvingly. "Completely independent. Your marital assets are legally separate." Rachel blinked. "Meaning Albert has no claim," Laura Bennett answered calmly. "The Fairchild Trust was established before Elena's marriage and contains protective clauses specifically designed to prevent outside claims in the event of divorce." Jonathan added gently, "Margaret Fairchild was cautious." Elena allowed herself a brief memory. Margaret, sitting beside the fireplace in the old house in Maine, explaining the difference between generosity and vulnerability. Money, her grandmother once said, should give you freedom, never dependency. Back in the conference room, Elena turned another page of the document. "What level of control do I have?" Laura replied without hesitation. "Full control as managing beneficiary. However, our firm will continue handling daily portfolio management unless you choose otherwise." Elena nodded slowly. "I'd prefer to keep the existing structure for now." Laura made a note. Jonathan leaned slightly forward. "There is one additional matter we should discuss." Elena looked up. "Your grandmother included a clause in the trust documents recommending legal counsel in the event of marital instability." Rachel's eyebrows lifted. "Your grandmother knew about Albert." Jonathan smiled faintly. Margaret Fairchild believed in preparing for possibilities. Elena closed the folder quietly. "I will need legal guidance," she said. Jonathan did not ask why. Instead, he opened another file. "Then we should begin by reviewing your current financial situation." Rachel glanced at Elena. It was a subtle moment, but the narrator could see the shift clearly. For months, perhaps years, Elena had been quietly collecting fragments of information. Emails, receipts, flight confirmations. Now, for the first time, those fragments had context. Jonathan continued. "Do you have access to all joint accounts?" "Yes. Credit records, yes." Jonathan nodded. "Good. Our next step is to review everything," Laura Bennett added. "Given the size of the trust, we must also ensure there are no external liabilities that could attempt to attach themselves to your financial profile." Rachel leaned forward slightly. Like Albert's spending, Jonathan looked toward Elena. "That depends on the circumstances." Elena reached into her bag, the same small folder she had carried for months. Inside were the copies she had already collected. She placed them on the table. Jonathan opened the folder carefully. Airline confirmations, hotel charges, credit card statements, each page neatly organized. Laura Bennett studied them with quiet interest. Jonathan raised an eyebrow slightly. "You've been documenting these for some time." Elena's voice remained calm. Yes. The narrator understood something important in that moment. Elena was not gathering information out of anger. She was gathering it because she believed truth required structure. Jonathan flipped through several pages before pausing. This is thorough. Rachel smiled faintly. You should see the spreadsheet. Laura Bennett looked up. There's more, Elena nodded. Much more. Jonathan leaned back slowly in his chair. Miss Fairchild, he said carefully, I believe the first step will be to involve a forensic accountant. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. That's serious. Jonathan closed the folder. When financial records begin forming patterns like this, he said quietly, it's rarely accidental. Outside the tall windows of the law office, Boston moved through another ordinary afternoon. Cars flowed through traffic. Pedestrians crossed busy streets. The city remained unaware that inside a quiet conference room, the foundation of Albert Whitmore's carefully managed life had just begun to crack. And thousands of miles away, Albert himself still believed the most complicated part of the week had been leaving the hospital hallway. He had not yet realized that Elena Fairchild was no longer merely observing. She was preparing. The first night Elena Fairchild spent back in the brownstone felt different from every night before it. The house was quiet in a way that no longer carried tension. For months, silence inside those walls had been filled with waiting for Albert's key in the door, waiting for explanations, waiting for conversations that never quite happened. Now the quiet belonged to something else. Lucas slept in a bassinet beside Elena's bed, the small machine that monitored his breathing glowing faintly in the darkness. Rachel had insisted on staying the first few nights. She slept on the couch downstairs, though sleep for either of them came in short fragments between feedings and the soft sounds of the newborn adjusting to the world. Just after 2 a.m, Lucas stirred. Elena sat up slowly, careful of the soreness that still lingered from childbirth. She lifted him gently and sat in the rocking chair near the window. Outside, Boston's streets were empty. The city lights reflected faintly on the wet pavement from earlier rain. Lucas quieted quickly. Elena watched him while he drank, his tiny fingers curling instinctively against the sleeve of her sweater. For a long time, she simply sat there. Then, once Lucas fell asleep again, she reached for her laptop. The same habit she had practiced for months returned naturally. Observation, documentation, clarity. The spreadsheet opened automatically when the laptop woke. Rows of dates, charges, airline reservations, restaurant receipts. What had once looked like scattered details now appeared differently after the meeting with Jonathan Pierce and Laura Bennett. Patterns were easier to recognize when someone knew what to look for. Elena scrolled through the entries slowly. January. Several late-night dinners billed as client meetings. But the restaurants were small, intimate places in neighborhoods far from Albert's office. February. 2 hotel charges in Manhattan during a week Albert claimed he had attended a corporate conference. March. The Miami flight. Elena added 1 new line. March 14th. Albert departure during active labor. She paused before saving the document. Across the room, Lucas made a soft noise in his sleep. Elena closed the laptop. Morning arrived quietly. Rachel was already awake when Elena came downstairs carrying Lucas. Coffee, Rachel asked. Yes, please. Rachel handed her a mug before leaning over the bassinet Rachel had set up near the kitchen table. Good morning, Lucas, she whispered. The baby blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. Rachel straightened. So she said, lowering her voice, have you decided what comes next? Elena took a sip of coffee. Yes. Rachel waited. I start with the accounts. Rachel nodded. That's the Elena I know. Later that afternoon, Elena logged into the shared financial accounts she and Albert had used throughout their marriage. For years, Albert had handled most of the household payments. At the time, it had seemed efficient. Now it was simply another set of records waiting to be examined. Elena moved carefully. First, she downloaded the past 12 months of credit card statements. Then the checking account transactions. Finally, the business travel reimbursements Albert sometimes processed through their shared expenses. By early evening, the dining room table was covered in printed pages. Rachel stared at the stacks. "You know, most people would hire someone else to do this." "I will," Elena said calmly. "But first, I need to understand it myself." Rachel leaned over one of the pages. "Okay, this one's weird." She pointed to a transaction near the middle of the statement. A transfer. $25,000. Recipient Crestline Holdings, LLC. Rachel frowned. "What's Crestline?" Elena opened another window on her laptop. Good question. It took less than 5 minutes to find the first clue. Crestline Holdings was registered in Delaware. Rachel groaned. That's never a good sign. Elena continued searching. Corporate registration records appeared. Minimal information. One listed manager. Rachel leaned closer to the screen. "Wait." Elena froze for a moment. The manager's name appeared clearly in the document. Albert Whitmore. Rachel leaned back in her chair slowly. "He has a company you didn't know about." Elena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she printed the registration record and placed it beside the bank statement. Another pattern, another piece. Rachel rubbed her temples. "How much has he moved through this thing?" Elena returned to the transaction list. More entries began to stand out. Smaller transfers at first. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000. Each one sent to the same entity. Crestline Holdings, LLC. Rachel whistled softly. That adds up. Elena totaled the numbers. $78,000. Rachel stared at the page. "And that's just what you've seen?" Elena nodded. The narrator understood something Rachel did not yet realize. Elena's calm was not the calm of someone unbothered. It was the calm of someone building a complete picture. Later that evening, Elena sent a secure message to Jonathan Pierce. Attached were copies of the bank transfers and corporate records. The reply came within an hour. "Miss Fairchild, thank you for forwarding these documents. I believe it would be wise to bring in a forensic accountant immediately. I recommend Kevin Patel, who specializes in financial tracing. He will contact you tomorrow." Elena closed the email. Upstairs, Lucas began to cry again. Rachel stood up. "I've got him." Elena shook her head. "No." She carried Lucas gently back to the rocking chair. While the baby settled, Rachel leaned against the doorway. "You're handling this better than I expected." Elena looked down at Lucas. "He deserves stability," Rachel nodded. And Albert, Elena's voice remained even. "Albert will have whatever truth he created." The next afternoon, Kevin Patel arrived at the brownstone. He was in his early 40s, soft-spoken with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to long hours of data analysis. Elena laid the documents across the dining table. Kevin studied them carefully. "How long have you been collecting these?" he asked. "Several months." Kevin nodded slowly. "That helps." Rachel watched from the kitchen while Kevin opened his laptop and began entering numbers. Within 30 minutes, patterns began appearing. "Here," Kevin said, pointing to the screen. "These transfers to Crestline." Elena leaned closer. Kevin continued. "Money moves from your joint account into Crestline, then out again, to where Rachel asked." Kevin clicked another tab. "That's what we'll find out." Outside the tall windows, evening settled across Boston once again. Inside the quiet brownstone, the investigation into Albert Whitmore's financial life had officially begun. And for the first time, Elena Fairchild was no longer simply recording events as they happened. She was following the money. Albert Whitmore returned to Boston on a gray Sunday afternoon. The flight from Miami had been uneventful, the kind of quiet return trip that allowed a traveler to believe the world waiting at home would still be arranged exactly as it had been before. From 30,000 feet, the coastline of Massachusetts had appeared calm and familiar. Albert had watched it through the oval airplane window with the mild fatigue of someone who had spent the weekend drinking champagne beside a swimming pool. He had not opened the message Rachel Monroe sent the previous evening, nor had he replied to the photo of his newborn son. In Albert's mind, there was still time for that. When the plane touched down at Logan International Airport, he checked his phone again, while passengers stood in the aisle gathering their luggage. 3 unread messages from Rachel. 2 emails from work. Nothing from Elena. Albert frowned slightly. He had expected at least one message. Something emotional. Something complicated. But Elena had always been quiet during conflict. He assumed the silence meant she was tired, or perhaps simply overwhelmed by the baby. Outside the airport, a cold wind swept across the pickup lane as Albert climbed into a taxi. "Back Bay," he told the driver. During the ride across the Charles River, he finally opened Rachel's earlier message. The photo appeared again on the screen. Elena lying in the hospital bed, the baby in her arms. Albert studied it for a moment. The infant looked small, fragile in a way that made Albert briefly uncomfortable. He locked the phone and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Congratulations," the taxi driver said casually, glancing at the baby photo, still faintly visible on the screen reflection. Albert gave a polite nod. "Thanks." The brownstone stood exactly as it always had when Albert returned from business trips. Tall brick facade, black iron railing, a quiet, respectable home on a quiet Boston street. Albert paid the driver and climbed the steps with his suitcase. Inside the house smelled faintly of coffee and something warm, perhaps soup. Rachel Monroe sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open in front of her. She looked up when Albert entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Albert set his suitcase near the door. Rachel. Her expression remained neutral. "Albert, where's Elena?" Rachel nodded toward the stairs. "Upstairs with Lucas." Albert hesitated slightly. "Lucas? Your son," Rachel said evenly. Albert cleared his throat. "Right." He moved toward the staircase. Rachel's voice stopped him halfway. "She was in labor for 6 hours after you left." Albert turned back. "I know, I heard." Rachel closed the laptop slowly. "No," she said. "You didn't." Albert sighed faintly. "Rachel, I really don't want to argue." Rachel stood. "Then don't." She stepped aside. Albert climbed the stairs. The bedroom door upstairs stood slightly open. Inside, Elena sat in the rocking chair beside the window, Lucas resting quietly against her shoulder. For a moment, Albert simply stood in the doorway. The room looked different. Softer, smaller, a bassinet beside the bed. A folded blanket draped across the chair. Elena looked up. Their eyes met. Albert forced a small smile. "Hey." Elena nodded once. Albert stepped inside. "So, he's here." Elena adjusted Lucas gently before standing. Albert looked down at the baby. "He's tiny." "Most newborns are," Elena said quietly. Albert chuckled awkwardly. "I guess that makes sense." The narrator knew something Albert could not yet see. The distance between them in that room was not the distance of anger. It was the distance of conclusion. Albert leaned slightly closer. "Can I hold him?" Elena considered the question for only a second before placing Lucas carefully into Albert's arms. Albert shifted, uncomfortably uncertain how to support the infant's head. Lucas made a small noise. Albert stiffened. "Is that normal?" "Yes." Albert held the baby for less than a minute before handing him back. "He's fragile." Elena adjusted the blanket again. "Yes." Albert rubbed the back of his neck. "So, everything okay here?" Elena nodded. "Yes." Her calm unsettled him slightly. He had expected something else. Tears, questions, maybe anger. Instead, Elena seemed composed in a way that made conversation feel strangely unnecessary. Albert glanced around the room. "You didn't call me after he was born?" Rachel's voice drifted faintly from downstairs. "She did." Albert ignored the comment. Elena spoke evenly. "You were traveling." Albert frowned. "I still would have liked to know. You knew." Albert hesitated. That was technically true. Rachel's message had told him. He changed the subject. "I'll take some time off work this week," he said. "Help out." Elena shook her head. "That won't be necessary." Albert blinked. "What do you mean?" Elena walked to the dresser and picked up a small envelope. "From now on," she said calmly, Any discussions about finances should go through my attorney. Albert stared at her. Your attorney, yes? Albert laughed softly. Elena, come on. She handed him the envelope. Inside was a business card. Jonathan Pierce. Pierce and Aldridge. Albert's smile faded slightly. What is this legal representation? Albert set the card on the dresser. You hired a lawyer because I went on a work trip. Elena did not respond. Albert's tone sharpened. This is ridiculous. From downstairs, Rachel's voice rose again. Is it? Albert ignored her. Elena, we're tired. You just had a baby. He gestured vaguely. Let's not make things dramatic. Elena sat back in the rocking chair. Lucas slept peacefully in her arms. Her voice remained calm. I'm not making anything dramatic. Albert spread his hands. Then why the lawyer? Elena met his eyes. Because I prefer clarity. Albert frowned. What does that mean? It means Elena said quietly that every financial matter between us will now be documented. Albert's jaw tightened slightly. You don't trust me? Elena did not answer that question. Instead, she asked one of her own. What is Crestline Holdings? Albert froze. Only for a second. But it was enough. Rachel appeared at the doorway behind him. Albert forced a small laugh. It's a consulting structure. Elena nodded slowly. I see. Albert felt something shift in the room, a feeling he had not experienced with Elena before. Loss of control. He tried to recover the conversation. Elena, whatever you think you found, I didn't find anything, she said softly. I recorded it. Albert opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time since he had entered the house, he realized something important. The quiet woman sitting in the rocking chair was no longer waiting for explanations. She already had them. And somewhere downstairs on the dining table, stacks of printed bank records were waiting for someone else to examine. The next morning, in the Fairchild brownstone, began with the soft, irregular rhythm of a newborn's schedule. Lucas woke just before sunrise. The faint cry carried gently through the quiet hallway upstairs, and Elena Fairchild was already awake by the time the sound reached the kitchen below where Rachel Monroe sat with her laptop and a cup of coffee. Rachel looked up toward the ceiling. Morning shift again, she murmured. Upstairs, Elena moved slowly but efficiently. The physical soreness from childbirth had not fully faded, but the steady routine of caring for Lucas had already begun to settle into place. She lifted him carefully, cradling his small body against her shoulder while crossing to the rocking chair beside the window. Outside, Boston was waking. Delivery trucks rumbled along the street. A man walked his dog past the iron gate. The early light painted the brick buildings in pale gold. Lucas quieted as Elena fed him. In the quiet moment, Elena's mind moved back to the conversation from the night before. Albert's expression when she mentioned Crestline Holdings. The brief pause before he answered. It had been small, but pauses often revealed more than words. Downstairs, Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. Kevin Patel, she muttered. She answered. Morning, Kevin. The forensic accountant's calm voice came through clearly. Good morning, Rachel. Is Elena available? She's upstairs with the baby. Tell her I've started tracing the Crestline transfers. Rachel straightened slightly, and Kevin hesitated only briefly. It's more complicated than I expected. Rachel's eyebrows lifted. That's usually not good news, Kevin continued. I'll explain when I get there. Rachel ended the call just as Albert Whitmore entered the kitchen. He looked tired. His shirt was wrinkled, and there was a faint tension in the way he rubbed his temples while reaching for a glass of water. Rachel watched him without greeting. Albert glanced toward her. You're still here. Rachel sipped her coffee. Someone has to be. Albert ignored the comment. Where's Elena upstairs? Albert nodded and poured water into the glass. Rachel spoke again before he left the room. Kevin Patel is coming back. Albert turned slowly. Who, the forensic accountant? Albert stared at her. Rachel shrugged. You know, the guy who's looking at the money trail. Albert's expression hardened. This is getting ridiculous. Rachel closed her laptop calmly. Maybe. Albert set the glass down harder than necessary. Elena is overreacting. Rachel leaned back in her chair. No, she said evenly. She's catching up. Albert walked out of the kitchen without responding. Upstairs, Elena had just placed Lucas back in the bassinet when Albert entered the room. He closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Elena nodded once. Albert crossed his arms. "What exactly do you think is happening here?" Elena sat quietly in the rocking chair. "You transferred money into a private company," she said. Albert laughed lightly. "That's called business. You transferred joint funds." Albert's smile faded slightly. Temporary movement. For what purpose? Albert exhaled sharply. "Elena, you're looking at numbers without context. Then explain the context." Albert hesitated. For the narrator, this moment carried a quiet significance. Albert Whitmore had spent years speaking confidently in conference rooms, persuading executives and investors with carefully constructed explanations. But here, in a quiet bedroom with a newborn sleeping nearby, those same instincts felt strangely less effective. "It's a consulting structure," Albert repeated. Elena nodded slowly. "And the apartment in Manhattan?" Albert blinked. What apartment? Elena held his gaze. The property purchased through Crestline Holdings. Albert's silence stretched longer this time. "You've been spying on me," he said finally. "No," Elena replied calmly. "I've been recording our finances." Albert paced once across the room. "This is insane." Elena remained still. "Kevin Patel will explain the transactions." Albert stopped. "You hired someone to investigate me." Elena did not raise her voice. "I hired someone to verify the records." Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Rachel opened it to find Kevin Patel standing on the front step with a laptop bag over his shoulder. "Morning," Kevin said politely. Rachel stepped aside. "You picked a good time." Kevin entered the dining room where the printed financial documents were still spread across the table. He opened his laptop immediately. Within minutes, Elena joined them downstairs. Albert remained upstairs for a moment before slowly descending the stairs as well. Kevin greeted Elena first. "I've traced the Crestline account activity." Rachel pulled out a chair, and Kevin turned the laptop toward them. A series of financial pathways appeared on the screen. Lines branching between accounts, dates, transfers. Kevin pointed to the first sequence. "Money from the joint Whitmore account moves into Crestline Holdings." He clicked again. "From Crestline, funds are redirected into several separate payments." Rachel leaned closer, where Kevin opened another file. Here. The document displayed a property purchase. Location Manhattan. Buyer Crestline Holdings, LLC. Albert's jaw tightened. Rachel read the address aloud softly. "That's a luxury condo." Kevin nodded. "Purchased 3 months ago." Rachel looked at Albert. "You've been busy?" Albert said nothing. Kevin continued calmly. "There's more." He opened an audio file. This was recovered from a voicemail backup linked to Mr. Whitmore's secondary phone. Rachel frowned. "Secondary phone," Albert's eyes flashed. "Don't play that." Kevin pressed the space bar. Albert's voice filled the room through the laptop speakers. "She'll never leave. Elena doesn't do confrontation." Another voice followed. "Sabrina Cole. So when do we move into the apartment?" Albert's recorded voice answered easily. "Soon." Kevin paused the file. The room fell silent. Rachel slowly exhaled. "Well," she said quietly, "that's context." Elena did not react outwardly. She simply closed her notebook after writing down the file name and timestamp. Albert stared at the screen. For the first time since returning home, he looked uncertain. Not because the truth had appeared, but because the truth had been organized. And organization, Elena understood, was far more dangerous than accusation. The silence in the dining room lingered long after the audio file stopped playing. Kevin Patel did not rush to fill it. Forensic accountants understood the value of letting information settle in the air. Numbers had a way of speaking more clearly when no one interrupted them. Rachel Monroe leaned back slowly in her chair. "Well," she said quietly, "that explains the apartment." Across the table, Albert Whitmore stood perfectly still. His gaze remained fixed on the laptop screen, as though the evidence displayed there might change if he stared at it long enough. Elena Fairchild closed her notebook. The soft click of the cover sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Kevin cleared his throat gently. "This appears to be only the first layer," he said. Albert turned toward him. "What does that mean?" Kevin adjusted his glasses. "It means the Crestline account isn't the final destination for most of these transfers." Rachel frowned. "You mean there's more?" Kevin nodded. He tapped the keyboard again, opening a new financial map. More lines appeared on the screen, additional pathways branching outward from Crestline Holdings. After the property purchase, Kevin continued several other transfers occurred. He pointed to a highlighted section, large ones. Rachel leaned forward again. How large? Kevin clicked another document. $200,000 total over the past 4 months. Albert spoke for the first time since the audio had played. "That's my money." Kevin did not argue. "Some of it, maybe." Elena looked at the screen, but not all of it. Kevin nodded slightly. The joint account funded a significant portion. Rachel let out a low whistle. "So you used household funds to buy a Manhattan condo for your girlfriend?" Albert's jaw tightened. "It's an investment." Rachel laughed softly. "Sure." Albert looked at Elena. "You're letting this get completely out of control." Elena remained calm. "I'm letting the record speak." Albert turned to Kevin. "You're violating my privacy." Kevin shook his head politely. "These are financial accounts legally accessible to Mrs. Whitmore." Albert's voice sharpened. "Elena." She met his eyes. "Yes, you're turning a misunderstanding into a legal circus." The narrator could see something Albert could not. Elena was not escalating. She was simply allowing the process to move forward. Kevin clicked another tab. There was also the matter of outstanding debt. Albert froze again. "What debt?" Kevin rotated the screen toward him. "These transactions suggest several short-term loans taken through Crestline." Rachel blinked. "You borrowed money too?" Kevin nodded. "Approximately $300,000. Rachel leaned back. "Wow." Albert's voice rose slightly. "That's business leverage." Kevin remained composed. "The loans are unsecured." Rachel looked between them. "That sounds bad." Kevin answered carefully. "It means if repayment fails, creditors may pursue associated accounts." Albert looked at Elena. "You see what you're doing?" Elena said nothing. Kevin closed the laptop for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," he said calmly, "my responsibility is to clarify financial exposure." Albert crossed his arms. "There isn't any." Kevin paused. "That depends on whether Crestline Holdings remains solvent." Rachel rubbed her forehead. "So if it collapses?" Kevin finished the thought. "Creditors might attempt to attach related assets." Albert looked suddenly uneasy. Elena spoke quietly. "The Fairchild Trust is legally separate?" Kevin nodded. "Yes." Albert turned toward her sharply. The what? Rachel watched carefully. Elena met Albert's gaze without hesitation. "My grandmother's estate." Albert frowned. "You mentioned something about that." Elena folded her hands. "She passed away 3 days before Lucas was born." Albert's expression softened briefly. "I'm sorry." Elena acknowledged the statement with a small nod. Then she continued. "I inherited her trust." Albert waited. Rachel spoke the number. $500 million. Albert blinked. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. Then he laughed. "That's not funny." Rachel didn't smile. "It's not a joke." Albert looked at Elena again. "You're serious?" "Yes." The narrator understood that this was the exact moment Albert Whitmore's mental calculations began rearranging themselves. Not regret, not remorse, calculation. Albert sat slowly in one of the dining chairs. $500 million. Elena corrected gently. 512. Rachel watched his expression change. Shock first, then something sharper, something closer to realization. Albert leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena answered calmly. "I didn't know until after Lucas was born." Albert shook his head slowly. "That changes things," Rachel muttered under her breath. Does it? Albert ignored her. Elena, if we'd known about this earlier. He paused. We could have planned. Elena studied him quietly. For what Albert spread his hands. Investments, expansion. Rachel laughed again. You mean the Manhattan condo? Albert's eyes flashed. Stay out of this. Rachel stood. I'd love to. Kevin spoke before the argument could escalate. There is still a legal question that must be addressed. Everyone looked at him. Kevin opened his laptop again. The funds transferred from the joint account may qualify as marital misappropriation. Albert frowned. What does that mean? Kevin explained evenly. It means those funds were used for purposes outside the marriage. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Like buying property for your girlfriend. Albert glared at her. Kevin continued. In divorce proceedings, such transactions are often considered when determining asset distribution. Albert turned to Elena. You're planning a divorce. Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up her pen and wrote a final note in her notebook. March 18th. Financial tracing confirms Crestline transfers and Manhattan property. Only then did she look up. Yes. Albert stared at her. You're serious? Elena's voice remained calm. I prefer clarity. Rachel folded her arms. Seems like you're finally getting it. Albert stood abruptly. This is insane. Kevin packed his laptop quietly. For what it's worth, he said politely, the records are very clear. Albert looked at Elena one last time. For years, he had believed he understood exactly who his wife was. Quiet, predictable, patient. What he had never realized was that Elena Fairchild had never needed to argue to win. She only needed the truth to finish assembling itself. 2 days later, Albert Whitmore was standing in the lobby of his consulting firm's Boston office when the process server approached him. The moment was ordinary enough that Albert almost ignored it. He had just stepped out of the elevator, coffee in hand, reviewing emails on his phone, while the morning traffic hummed faintly outside the glass doors. Mr. Whitmore Albert looked up. The man standing in front of him wore a dark coat and carried a thin manila envelope. Yes, the man extended the envelope calmly. You've been served. Albert frowned. Served with what legal documents? Albert stared at the envelope for a moment before taking it. Around them, a few employees crossed the lobby on their way toward the elevators, unaware of the quiet disruption unfolding. Albert opened the envelope slowly. The first page carried the heading of the Massachusetts Family Court. Petitioner Elena Fairchild Whitmore. Respondent Albert Whitmore. Rachel Monroe would later say that the silence in that moment was almost theatrical. But the narrator understood it differently. For Albert Whitmore, the envelope was the first physical confirmation that the situation inside the brownstone had already moved beyond conversation. Divorce petition, motion to preserve marital assets, financial disclosure request. Albert read the words twice before looking up again. The process server had already left. Upstairs in the consulting firm's conference room, Albert sat alone, staring at the documents. He had spent his career navigating complex negotiations, but this felt different. The structure of the petition was precise, the language calm. It did not accuse. It simply documented. Albert flipped to the attached financial exhibits. Several pages of transaction summaries, Crestline holdings, the Manhattan condo, joint account withdrawals. Even the Miami flight confirmation appeared in the timeline. Albert felt a slow tightening in his chest. For the first time since returning home, the possibility that he might actually lose control of the situation began to feel real. He pulled out his phone. The first call went to Elena. It rang, then went to voicemail. Albert ended the call and tried again. Voicemail. His third call went to Rachel Monroe. She answered on the second ring. What? Albert exhaled sharply. Rachel put Elena on the phone. No. Albert's voice tightened. This isn't a joke. Rachel's tone remained flat. Neither are legal documents. Albert rubbed his forehead. I need to talk to her. Rachel paused briefly. She has an attorney for that. Albert's patience snapped. Rachel, stop being difficult. Rachel laughed quietly. Albert, you bought a condo for your girlfriend with joint funds. Albert closed his eyes. That's not the point. It's literally the point. Albert ended the call. Across the city, Elena Fairchild sat in the conference room at Pierce and Aldridge with Jonathan Pierce and Laura Bennett. Lucas slept peacefully in a bassinet beside her chair. Jonathan slid a document across the table. "The petition has been filed," he said calmly. Elena nodded. "And the asset preservation order," Jonathan adjusted his glasses. "The court will review it within 48 hours, Laura Bennett added gently. "This ensures no additional funds are moved during proceedings." Elena folded her hands. "Good." Jonathan looked at her for a moment. "You're handling this remarkably well." Elena glanced down at Lucas. "I prefer certainty." Jonathan nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother would appreciate that." The narrator knew something Margaret Fairchild had once said to Jonathan years earlier. If Elena ever needs to defend herself, Margaret had told him quietly she won't shout. She'll prepare. Back in the consulting office, Albert began making calls. First to his personal attorney, then to his financial advisor. Then final toleration we fly normally to Sabrina Cole. Sabrina answered quickly. "Hey?" Albert spoke without greeting. "Elena filed for divorce." There was a short pause. "Already, yes." Sabrina sounded thoughtful rather than surprised. "Does she know about the condo?" Albert hesitated. "Yes." Another pause. "That's inconvenient." Albert leaned back in his chair. You think Sabrina's tone remained calm. "So what happens now?" Albert stared at the stack of legal documents on the table. "She thinks she can take everything." Sabrina laughed lightly. "She can't." Albert didn't respond immediately. Her grandmother left her a trust. Sabrina waited. "How big?" Albert swallowed slightly. 500 million? The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds longer than before. Finally, Sabrina spoke again. $500 million. Yes. Her voice changed subtly. "Well," she said carefully, "that complicates things." Albert nodded, though she could not see it. "I'm handling it." "Of course you are," Sabrina said. But the narrator noticed something Albert did not. Sabrina's interest had sharpened, because wealth at that scale had a gravity of its own. Back in the Pierce and Aldridge conference room, Jonathan Pierce reviewed the next steps. Mr. Whitmore will be required to provide full financial disclosure. Elena nodded. In the condo, Jonathan turned a page in the file. It may qualify as dissipation of marital assets. Rachel Munro, seated near the window, looked up. "Meaning he bought it with family money?" Jonathan nodded. "And that matters." Rachel smiled faintly. "That's putting it mildly." Jonathan closed the file. There will likely be a preliminary hearing. Elena remained calm. "When soon?" Lucas stirred softly in the bassinet. Elena reached over and adjusted the blanket. Across the city, Albert Whitmore stood in front of the large window in his office, looking out over the Boston skyline. For years, he had believed he understood how negotiations worked. Leverage, timing, influence. But what Albert had never faced before was an opponent who had already finished gathering the evidence. And Elena Fairchild had been collecting it for months. Albert Whitmore did not sleep much the night after receiving the divorce papers. The city outside his apartment window was quiet, the faint glow of Boston streetlights reflecting off the Charles River, but his mind moved restlessly through possibilities he had not considered until recently. For years, Albert had believed he understood how most conflicts unfolded. Pressure, negotiation, eventually compromise. But Elena Fairchild had not argued with him. She had not demanded explanations. She had not even raised her voice. Instead, she had filed paperwork. And paperwork, Albert was beginning to realize, did not negotiate emotionally. It proceeded. Just after midnight, Albert opened his laptop at the kitchen table and began searching. Fairchild Investment Trust. He had typed the name several times already that evening, each time hoping the search results would reveal something smaller than what Elena had described. They did not. Corporate filings, investment reports, old financial news articles referencing Margaret Fairchild as an early investor in several technology companies during the late 1990s. Albert scrolled slowly through the information. One article described the trust's portfolio growth across multiple sectors: renewable energy, commercial real estate, private technology funds. Estimated valuation over $500 million. Albert leaned back in the chair. The number still felt unreal. But more unsettling than the number itself was the realization that he had never known any of this existed. During the years of their marriage, Elena had never mentioned wealth on that scale. Margaret Fairchild had visited them only occasionally, always polite, always reserved. Albert had assumed she was simply an elderly woman living comfortably in Maine. He had never imagined the quiet woman with silver hair and measured speech had been managing one of the largest private family trusts in the region. Albert closed the laptop slowly. For the first time, he began calculating something new. Not the loss of Elena, the loss of access. Across the city, Elena Fairchild sat in the living room of the brownstone. Lucas asleep in her arms. Rachel Monroe sat nearby on the couch, flipping through a legal guide Jonathan Pierce had given them earlier that day. Preliminary hearings are usually procedural, Rachel said, mostly scheduling and asset disclosures. Elena nodded. She had spent the afternoon reviewing financial forms Jonathan required before the court hearing. Account balances, investment disclosures, trust documentation. Everything was being prepared carefully. Rachel glanced at her. "You still haven't heard from Albert Number," Rachel shrugged. "That might be a good sign." Elena adjusted Lucas's blanket. "He called earlier." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And I didn't answer." Rachel smiled faintly. Progress. The narrator understood something Rachel sensed but could not fully articulate. Elena was not ignoring Albert out of anger. She was allowing the legal process to define the conversation instead. That difference would matter later. The following afternoon, Albert finally called again. This time, Elena answered. "Hello?" Albert spoke quickly. "Elena, we need to talk. We can speak through attorneys. Not about this." Elena waited. Albert lowered his voice. "I didn't understand the situation." "What situation?" "The trust." Elena's expression did not change. "I see." Albert continued. "If I'd known earlier," Elena interrupted softly. "Known what?" "That you were inheriting that kind of money." The narrator noted the subtle shift in Albert's language. Not grief, not apology, calculation. Albert continued. "We could have handled things differently." Elena remained calm. "Albert, yes, my grandmother's estate has nothing to do with our marriage." Albert exhaled. "Of course it does." "No." Albert hesitated. "Elena, $500 million changes everything." Elena looked down at Lucas. "No," she said quietly. "It only reveals things." Albert was silent for several seconds. Finally, he spoke again. "I made mistakes." Elena did not argue. The narrator knew something Albert had not yet fully grasped. Apologies offered after financial consequences appeared rarely carried the weight of genuine remorse. Albert continued. "The condo, Sabrina. Those were temporary situations." Rachel, sitting across the room, mouthed the word temporary with disbelief. Elena spoke calmly. "You purchased a property through a hidden company." Albert sighed. "Yes, with joint funds, yes. And you left the hospital while I was in labor." Albert closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Elena's voice remained steady. "The court will consider those facts." Albert's frustration began creeping back into his tone. "You're acting like this is a courtroom already." "It is." Albert ran a hand through his hair. "Elena, we have a child now. I'm aware. Lucas deserves 2 parents." Elena nodded. "He will have 2 parents." Albert paused. "So we can work this out?" Elena answered simply. "No." The word landed with quiet finality. Albert's voice sharpened. "You're throwing away a marriage." Elena did not raise her voice. "The marriage ended when you chose to leave." Albert fell silent again. From the couch, Rachel watched carefully. For the first time since the conversation began, Albert seemed uncertain how to continue. Eventually, he spoke again more quietly. "You're really going through with this?" "Yes." Albert swallowed. "What about the trust?" Elena's tone did not change. "It remains mine." Albert understood then, not gradually, instantly. The inheritance would never become something he could access, not through negotiation, not through reconciliation, not through apology. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Meanwhile, across the room, Lucas stirred gently in Elena's arms. She rocked him slowly while speaking into the phone. "Our attorneys will coordinate the next steps," she said. Albert said nothing. "Elena." "Yes." For a moment, he sounded almost like the man she had married years earlier. "You've changed." Elena looked out the window toward the quiet Boston street. "No," she said softly. "I've stopped waiting." Then she ended the call. The courthouse in downtown Boston stood with the quiet authority of a building that had witnessed thousands of private conflicts transformed into public record. On a cool morning in early April, Elena Fairchild arrived 10 minutes before her scheduled hearing. She wore a simple navy coat and carried a small leather folder containing the documents Jonathan Pierce had prepared. Lucas remained at home with Rachel Monroe for the morning. The courthouse was not a place for infants. Jonathan Pierce met her in the hallway outside courtroom 4B. "You're early," he said with a small approving nod. Elena had always been early. "I prefer time to observe," she replied. Jonathan smiled faintly. "That habit will serve you well today." The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet but not empty. A few other couples waited on wooden benches, their attorneys speaking softly beside them. The tension in the air was subtle, but unmistakable, the quiet pressure of lives being reorganized by legal procedure. Albert Whitmore arrived 5 minutes later. He was accompanied by his attorney Daniel Roth, a tall man in his late 40s, whose expression carried the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Albert's eyes found Elena immediately. For a moment, he looked as though he might approach her. But Daniel Roth spoke quietly to him, and Albert remained beside his attorney instead. The narrator observed something Elena had already understood. Albert was no longer trying to speak directly to her. Now he was speaking through professionals. That was the language Elena had chosen. At precisely 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened. Inside, the room was smaller than most people expected when imagining legal drama. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only polished wooden benches, a judge's desk, and the quiet efficiency of court clerks organizing files. Judge Marjorie Klein entered the room moments later. Everyone stood. The hearing began with the calm, procedural tone that defined most family court proceedings. "Case number 24, 1783, the clerk announced. Fairchild Whitmore versus Whitmore. Elena sat beside Jonathan Pierce at the petitioner's table. Albert sat across the aisle beside Daniel Roth. Judge Klein reviewed the file briefly before looking up. "This hearing concerns temporary orders regarding financial disclosure and asset preservation," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, and uninterested in theatrics. Jonathan Pierce stood first. "Your Honor, the petitioner requests continuation of the asset preservation order already submitted. We also request expedited financial disclosure from the respondent." Judge Klein nodded slightly. And the basis for this request, Jonathan placed a thin binder on the podium. The respondent transferred marital funds into a privately controlled entity known as Crestline Holdings, LLC. Across the aisle, Daniel Roth stood. "Your Honor, these transfers were legitimate business investments." Jonathan did not raise his voice. "That may be addressed once full financial records are produced." Judge Klein turned to Daniel Roth. "Has your client provided complete financial disclosure?" Daniel hesitated slightly. "We are in the process of compiling those documents." Jonathan spoke again. "Your Honor, the petitioner has already submitted preliminary evidence demonstrating that Crestline Holdings purchased a luxury condominium in Manhattan." Judge Klein looked down at the file again. And the connection between this property and the respondent, Jonathan turned one page in the binder. "The property is registered under Crestline Holdings, LLC. Corporate filings identify Mr. Whitmore as the managing member." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Judge Klein raised an eyebrow. Mr. Whitmore Albert shifted slightly in his seat, but said nothing. Daniel Roth spoke carefully. "Your Honor, the property was acquired as part of an investment structure. Jonathan turned another page. We have also submitted a voicemail recording recovered from the respondent's phone backup. Daniel Roth immediately raised his hand. Objection to admissibility until proper authentication. Judge Klein nodded. That will be addressed later. Continue. Jonathan glanced briefly toward Elena before speaking again. The recording contains a conversation between Mr. Whitmore and Miss Sabrina Cole regarding occupancy of the Manhattan property. Across the aisle, Albert's jaw tightened. Judge Klein wrote something on her notepad. I see, Jonathan continued calmly. There is also a documented timeline showing the respondent departed Boston for Miami while the petitioner was in active labor. Daniel Roth shifted. That detail is irrelevant to financial proceedings. Jonathan remained composed. It speaks to the respondent's priorities during the period when these financial transfers occurred. Judge Klein looked up again. I will determine relevance. The narrator observed Elena during the exchange. She had not spoken once. Her hands rested quietly on the folder in front of her. Her posture remained steady. Albert noticed it too. For years, he had believed Elena's silence meant weakness. But here, inside the structured environment of the courtroom, silence had become something else, control. Judge Klein turned toward Daniel Roth. Mr. Roth, the court requires full financial disclosure within 14 days. Daniel nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The asset preservation order will remain in place until further review. Albert leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering something under his breath. Daniel spoke again. Your Honor, we request clarification regarding the petitioner's inheritance. The courtroom grew slightly quieter. Judge Klein glanced toward Elena. What inheritance? Jonathan answered. The Fairchild Investment Trust, Daniel Roth continued. Our concern is whether the petitioner's financial position affects temporary support considerations. Judge Klein flipped through the file again. Is the trust marital property? Jonathan responded immediately. No, Your Honor. It predates the marriage and is protected by independent trust structure. Judge Klein nodded. Then it is not relevant to asset division. Daniel Roth sat down again. Albert's shoulders stiffened slightly. The narrator understood the significance of that ruling. The trust, Elena's inheritance, remained entirely separate from the financial dispute. The judge closed the file. Temporary orders are granted as requested. The court will schedule the next hearing once financial disclosures are submitted. The gavel struck once. The hearing ended. Inside the courtroom, chairs shifted quietly as attorneys began gathering their files. Albert stood slowly. Across the aisle, Elena remained seated for a moment longer while Jonathan Pierce organized the binder. You handled that well, he said softly. Elena nodded. It's not finished. No, Jonathan agreed. Outside the courtroom, Albert waited near the hallway exit. For a brief moment, he looked as though he might speak to Elena again. But Jonathan Pierce walked beside her, and Daniel Roth was already guiding Albert toward the elevators. No words were exchanged. Yet the message of the morning hearing was already clear. The legal process had begun. And the facts Elena Fairchild had spent months documenting were now part of the court record. 2 months later, the second hearing took place under a clearer sky. Spring had fully settled over Boston by then. Trees along the streets near the courthouse had begun to bloom, and the air carried the faint warmth that followed a long winter. But inside, courtroom 4B, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Quiet, precise, unforgiving. Elena Fairchild arrived again with Jonathan Pierce at her side. This time, she appeared even calmer than before, dressed in a simple gray suit, her hair tied neatly behind her shoulders. Lucas was now nearly 3 months old. Rachel Monroe had stayed with him that morning at the brownstone, joking that the baby had already developed better sleeping habits than most adults. But Elena's mind was not on sleep. Today the court would review the complete financial disclosure Albert Whitmore had been required to submit. And more importantly, the additional evidence Kevin Patel had uncovered during the past 8 weeks. Across the hallway, Albert Whitmore stood beside Daniel Roth again. He looked different now, less confident. His usual posture, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted, had been replaced by something more cautious. For the first time since the proceedings began, Albert understood that the situation could not be controlled through conversation. Paperwork had its own momentum. Inside the courtroom, Judge Marjorie Klein took her seat promptly at 9 o'clock. The clerk announced the case. Fairchild Whitmore versus Whitmore. Jonathan Pierce stood first. Your Honor, since the previous hearing, the respondent has submitted the required financial disclosures. Judge Klein nodded. I have reviewed the filings. Jonathan placed another binder on the podium. We have as well. The judge gestured for him to continue. Jonathan opened the binder slowly. Our forensic accountant has traced the full movement of funds connected to Crestline Holdings, LLC. Across the room, Daniel Roth remained standing. Your Honor, the respondent maintains that these transactions were business-related. Jonathan nodded. That claim has been considered. He turned a page. However, the financial trail reveals a different pattern. Jonathan signaled toward Kevin Patel, who was seated quietly behind the petitioner's table. Kevin stood and approached the podium. Mr. Patel, the judge said, please summarize your findings. Kevin adjusted the microphone slightly. Over the past 6 months, Mr. Whitmore transferred approximately $278,000 from the marital joint account into Crestline Holdings. He clicked a remote and a digital screen beside the judge illuminated with a financial timeline. Lines and arrows connected accounts across multiple dates. From Crestline, Kevin continued the funds were distributed into 3 primary destinations. He pointed to the first, the Manhattan condominium purchase. Another arrow appeared. Payments to Miss Sabrina Cole. A third arrow followed. Short-term loan repayments related to speculative investment losses. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Judge Klein leaned slightly forward. Investment losses? Kevin nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel Roth stood again. These were private business activities. Kevin remained calm. The funds originated from the marital account. Judge Klein made a note. Jonathan Pierce spoke next. Your Honor, we would also like to present the final piece of documentation regarding the respondent's conduct during the relevant period. He turned to another page in the binder. Airport surveillance records. Daniel Roth immediately looked up. Jonathan continued. These records confirm that Mr. Whitmore boarded a flight to Miami at 12:47 p.m. on March 14th. Judge Klein glanced at the timeline again, and Jonathan spoke carefully. At that time, Mrs. Whitmore was in active labor at St. Matthew Medical Center. Daniel Roth exhaled slowly. Your Honor, personal marital issues should not influence financial decisions. Judge Klein looked toward Albert for the first time during the hearing. Mr. Whitmore. Albert stood. Yes, Your Honor. You left the hospital during your wife's labor. Albert hesitated only briefly. Yes. Judge Klein did not comment. Instead, she turned back toward Jonathan Pierce. The financial misuse appears documented. Jonathan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The narrator noticed Elena during the exchange. She remained exactly as she had during the previous hearing. Still, observant. Her pen rested quietly against the notebook on the table, though she had not written anything during the testimony. Because the facts now spoke for themselves. Jonathan continued. We are requesting that the court recognize the Crestline expenditures as dissipation of marital assets. Judge Klein closed the binder slowly. The courtroom waited. Finally, she spoke. The court finds sufficient evidence that joint marital funds were used for purposes unrelated to the marriage. Albert's shoulders stiffened. Judge Klein continued calmly. The Manhattan property and related transfers will therefore be considered during asset distribution. Daniel Roth nodded once, already calculating his next argument. But the judge had not finished. The Fairchild Investment Trust. She added, glancing briefly at Elena's file, remains legally separate property and will not be included in marital division. Albert looked down. For the first time during the proceedings, his expression revealed something close to realization. Not shock, but finality. The gavel sounded once. This matter will proceed to final settlement review. The hearing concluded. Outside the courtroom, the hallway slowly filled with movement again as attorneys gathered their documents. Jonathan Pierce closed the binder. "That went well," he said quietly. Elena nodded. Across the hallway, Albert stood beside Daniel Roth, speaking in low tones. At one point, he looked toward Elena again. But whatever thought crossed his mind, he did not approach her. Because the conversation between them had already moved beyond words. And the law had begun finishing what Elena Fairchild had started months earlier, with a single notebook and a quiet habit of observation. The final hearing took place on a warm morning in early summer. Boston had fully shifted into the long, bright days that followed spring. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the courthouse, illuminating the polished wooden floors of courtroom 4B. For Elena Fairchild, the day felt less like a confrontation and more like a closing chapter. She arrived early again. Jonathan Pierce walked beside her through the hallway, carrying the final settlement documents neatly arranged in a leather folder. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Elena considered the question for a moment. "Clear," she said. Jonathan nodded. Clarity had been Elena's objective from the beginning. Not revenge, not humiliation, just the quiet arrangement of truth into a form the law could recognize. Inside the courtroom, Albert Whitmore was already seated beside Daniel Roth. He looked older than he had 3 months earlier. The subtle confidence that once defined his posture had been replaced by something more restrained. Not broken, but diminished. The narrator understood something that neither attorney would ever say aloud. Albert had not lost because Elena fought harder. He had lost because Elena had waited longer. Judge Marjorie Klein entered promptly. Everyone stood. The clerk announced the case one final time. Fairchild Whitmore versus Whitmore. Jonathan Pierce rose first. "Your Honor, both parties have reviewed the final settlement terms." Judge Klein adjusted her glasses. In the agreement, Jonathan handed the document to the court clerk. "The petitioner accepts the proposed division of marital property as outlined." Daniel Roth stood next. The respondent agrees to the same terms. Judge Klein scanned the document briefly. The courtroom remained silent except for the soft turning of pages. Finally, she spoke. "The court recognizes the dissolution of marriage between Elena Fairchild Whitmore and Albert Whitmore." The words were spoken with calm neutrality, the same tone used for hundreds of similar rulings. But their meaning carried the weight of years. Judge Klein continued. "The Manhattan property purchased through Crestline Holdings will be classified as dissipation of marital assets." She turned a page. "The respondent will assume full responsibility for associated debts." Albert did not move. The judge continued. "The petitioner retains exclusive ownership of the Fairchild Investment Trust." Another page turned. "Primary physical custody of the minor child. Lucas Fairchild Whitmore will remain with the petitioner. Shared parenting arrangements will follow the schedule outlined in the agreement." She closed the document. "This matter is concluded." The gavel struck once. For a moment, the room remained perfectly still. Then the quiet sounds of movement returned, chairs, shifting papers being gathered, attorneys exchanging brief remarks. Jonathan Pierce leaned slightly toward Elena. "It's finished." Elena nodded. She felt no rush of triumph, no surge of victory, only the calm awareness that something long delayed had finally reached its natural conclusion. Across the aisle, Albert remained seated. Daniel Roth spoke to him quietly, but Albert seemed only partially aware of the conversation. Eventually, he stood. For a brief moment, his eyes met Elena's across the room. There was something in that look. Not anger, not apology. Perhaps simply recognition. Recognition that the woman he had once believed predictable had always possessed a strength he had never fully understood. Elena did not look away, but she did not step toward him either. The moment passed quietly. Albert turned and followed his attorney toward the hallway. Outside the courthouse, the summer air felt warm and open. Jonathan Pierce shook Elena's hand. "You handled this with remarkable discipline." Elena thanked him. Rachel Monroe was waiting near the courthouse steps. Lucas slept peacefully in a stroller beside her. Rachel smiled when she saw Elena, so Elena nodded once. "It's done." Rachel exhaled dramatically. Finally, she leaned down and adjusted Lucas's blanket. "Well, kid," she said softly to the sleeping baby, "your mom just won the calmest legal battle I've ever witnessed." Elena glanced down at her son. The narrator understood something important in that moment. Lucas would grow up knowing many things about the world, but one lesson would shape him more than most: that dignity does not need noise to defend itself. Rachel looked up. "So what happens now?" Elena considered the question. The brownstone still waited. The trust still required management. Life, in all its quiet complexity, continued. But the future no longer felt like something she had to endure. It felt like something she could build. "We go home," Elena said simply. Rachel nodded. "That sounds like a good plan." Together, they walked down the courthouse steps into the sunlight. Behind them, the legal process closed another file. But ahead of them, something quieter and far more meaningful was beginning. Elena Fairchild did not celebrate the end of her marriage. She simply walked forward with her son, leaving the past where it had already placed itself. In the end, stories like this rarely end with dramatic victories or public apologies. They end quietly. A signature on a document, a courtroom door closing, a parent walking outside into the sunlight with a child who will grow up learning what strength actually looks like. Elena Fairchild never raised her voice. She never chased revenge. She simply watched. She recorded. And when the time came, she allowed truth to speak in a language the world could not ignore. If you've stayed with this story until the end, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Stories travel far, but the people listening to them are always somewhere real. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be heard more often, you're welcome to follow the channel. There will always be another story waiting. One that reminds us that dignity, patience, and truth have a way of finding their place.